Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am Pradeep Khosla, Chancellor of UC San Diego. At UC San Diego, our support for our Jewish students and our Jewish community on campus has been unwavering, and we have been addressing anti-Semitism in many, many ways. Recently, we launched the Tritons Belong initiative. This initiative brings our community together to discuss and to learn from experts and one another with compassion and understanding. Today, I'm pleased to have two very distinguished guests with me to share their own conversation and expertise on anti-Semitism. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Williams, CEO and Finci-Viterbi Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation, and UC Regent Emeritus John Pérez. Dr. Williams is a renowned expert on anti-Semitism and Holocaust research. He has an extensive history of advising international organizations and governments on these issues. His work has led to shifts in EU policies related to the Holocaust and other mass atrocities. And he has been heavily involved in European and U.S. governmental measures in fight against anti-Semitism. Dr. Williams will be joined today by UC Regent Emeritus John Pérez. Regent Pérez is also a former California Assembly Speaker. He was the first LGBTQIA+ person of color elected to the California State Assembly and the first openly gay speaker elected in any state legislature. Regent Pérez is a vocal advocate for combating anti-Semitism, particularly in academic environments, and he has emphasized the importance of distinguishing between legitimate protest and actions that perpetuate hate. He has urged university leaders to foster environments where all students feel safe and respected. And I'm truly looking forward to listening to this conversation between these two leaders who are real role models for our society. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about their thoughts on anti-Semitism. It is all of our responsibility to address it to create a better and a more inclusive world. Now, I'll hand it over to Regent Emeritus John Pérez to begin this very important and timely discussion.
I want to thank Chancellor Khosla for that introduction, and Dr. Williams, thank you for joining us in this important conversation. You know, I've been thinking a lot about these issues, and it's sad to say that I've had far too many of these conversations. In my time as Speaker of the Assembly, in my time on the Board of Regents, I've been involved in too many conversations about patterns of hate as they've expressed themselves in our broader communities and in particular on our college campuses. And I think that what we've seen over the last 18 months has been, at least in my experience, an unprecedented spike in anti-Semitism as I've seen it expressed on college campuses throughout California. And from my lens, what I'm seeing in the broader community, but you have a much broader lens than do I. And I was hoping you could give us a little bit of a measure of whether what I'm seeing is what, in fact, you're seeing as well in terms of a spike in anti-Semitism.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for having me here today. It's not just a California challenge. It's not just a national challenge. And in many ways, this is a global challenge, at least in the transatlantic world. You know, we see more and more protests on campuses in the United Kingdom, in parts of Western Europe, even in parts of the former Yugoslavia. These issues have risen to the fore for a variety in a variety of ways, with a variety of causes behind it. But I think your assessment is correct. The last 18 months, approximately almost immediately after October 7th of last year, have been unique in American history. And just to give a bit of context, in 2010, I helped organize a workshop at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum dealing with campus anti-Semitism issues. And at the time, we had only a smattering of cases to choose from, some from within the California system, others from universities on the other coast, and a few from the University of Chicago. Those all pale in comparison to what we see today.
What was shocking to me is October 7th happens.
Right.
The greatest terrorist attack in the history of the State of Israel. And we saw reactions that were more muted than I expected. And in too many college campuses, and quite frankly, in broader society, I was shocked by a degree of both sidesism that weren't really focused on the actions of October 7th, but this effort to put it in some other context that really spoke to more than just the immediacy. The first place I went after the attacks on October 7th and spoke publicly about those tragic events was actually here at UC San Diego. I came to a UC San Diego Hillel dinner. And I did because there was this sense that students felt ignored at so many places, that they were frustrated by a muted response and by a response that tried to be about something broader than the moment. And even before Israel reacted to October 7th, I saw a spike in anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activity that I hadn't seen in my lifetime. And what is it that really drew this muted response in a way that was different than responses we'd seen when other communities had been targeted?
I think there are a few factors at play. First, over I would say the course of the past decade, we have seen, as you call it, both sidism around the Israel-Middle East issue growing across the spectrum of campuses in North America. Interestingly enough, especially on some campuses in Toronto and outside of Toronto, this has been a snowball effect that has built up. And the tendency to almost immediately try to excuse the scale of violence that took place in southern Israel began to pop up, as you say, not just on campus, but off campus. But it reached a tenor that is, A, I would say unprecedented, and B, almost moral, well, I wouldn't say almost, is morally reprehensible. What do I mean by that? The fact of the matter is the October 7th attacks were the largest act of mass violence against Jewish people since the Holocaust. There was a brief moment when the international community came together to say how terrible things were, and then the excuses began to pile up. That led to women's rights movements wholesale ignoring the violence that was committed against Israeli women that day, leading one to conclude that they were being ignored only because they were Israeli or only because they were Jewish. That is a product of a much longer trend, namely a trend that has excluded the Jewish experience from human rights discourse roughly since the mid-1970s. There are a variety of reasons why this came about, in part because the story of the Holocaust faded into the past in the human rights world, in part because the state of Israel was finally able to stand up for itself against external aggression. But by hook or by crook, Jews became excluded from our discussion around human rights, civil rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all of these conditions fed the problems that we see today.
Well, maybe we should go back and let's take a little historic look. I mean, Jews have existed in America since colonial times.
1654.
Southern Manhattan, predominantly Sephardic Jews at that point in the first community that we saw. But what's been the history? It seemed to have evolved over time in terms of the way that the Jewish community in the United States was viewed and was treated. And let's talk a little about that.
So, as you say, the first Jewish community came to the U.S. in 1654. They came up through Brazil, but they were Portuguese Jews who were Sephardic. Sephardic Jews mostly spoke Ladino, which is a Spanish form of Yiddish, for lack of a better explanation. They landed in New York, and almost immediately Peter Stuyvesant, one of the founders of New York, tried to kick them out. So this Jewish community appealed to the Dutch East India Company to be allowed to stay, and the response was they're welcome to stay as long as they make a contribution. And they did. They began farming. They began contributing to the local economy such that by the time one of those first Jewish settlers passed away, he had created the conditions for a we'll call it an estate, that was able to care for more than 100 people. And that pattern of contribution continued in different ways during the course of the American Revolution. Individuals like Haym Salomon made direct contributions to the war effort. There were Jews who served in the Continental Army along with my ancestors, and Jews existed almost, as a somewhat outside-inside community, but were largely tolerated by the predominantly Anglo-Saxon community of early America. The first act of violence against Jews didn't happen until the early 20th century with the lynching of Leo Frank in Marietta, Georgia. And this happened at the same time as the scourge of lynchings that claimed the lives of thousands of African Americans and hundreds of other communities, including Hispanic Americans and Indigenous Americans. But Leo Frank was the first act of murderous violence against Jews in our history. And then things quieted down again until the Civil Rights Movement. During the Civil Rights Movement,
Let me stop you there,
Yeah, sure.
because I don't know that things quieted down. I mean, we look at the beginning of the atrocities in Europe in the lead up to World War II, and America's response to refugees who were trying to flee,
Right.
that were predominantly Jewish refugees, and I wonder whether or not that's not a directly violent reaction.
Correct.
But when the result is people being left in a place where they're being persecuted, I think that's worthy of consideration and discussion.
Right. You're right. I'm talking about murderous violence, but the presence of anti-Semitism actually intermingled. It goes before World War II. This is in the 1920s, where you have the intermingling of, we'll call it anti-Latinx racism, anti-Eastern European racism, anti-Italian bias, and anti-Semitism, and anti-Asian hate. So you have a lot of things mixing at the same time. In the case of the Hispanic community, we know that they were largely being deported. Even many thousands of citizens of the United States were deported at that time.
Right. It was the mass deportation of
Right.
Mexican American. My mother's best friend,
Oh, really?
born in Arizona,
Yeah.
deported during the Great Depression as part of a mass deportation.
Right.
American citizen.
Prior to the start of the Roosevelt administration, unfortunately, that was a practice, and it's a scary reminder of what we can be capable of,
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act.
which was passed in the mid-1920s, not just focused on Asians, but also focused on people coming from Southern Europe, so predominantly Italians, and Eastern Europe, predominantly Jews. That fed a machine such that by the time the Nazis rose to power in 1933, and Jews began to look for ways to escape, the United States had effectively clamped down on emigration rules, making it extremely difficult for Jews to leave. In the later 1930s, there was a conference in Evian, France, where the international community came together to discuss, should we allow Jews to come to our shores? With one exception, every country said no, including the United States. So this act of anti-Semitism, which had direct policy implications, quite possibly led to the deaths of, well, the United States probably would not have taken millions, but so let's at least say thousands, if not tens of thousands. Right. There was also widespread anti-Semitism in American society at the time. There were individuals, prominent radio personalities, the internet of its age, like Father James Coughlin, who were rabid anti-Semites. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, reprinted a notorious anti-Semitic forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his personal newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And there were anti-Semites within the US government, including at the State Department, who directly interfered, trying to prevent Jews from entering. So anti-Semitism was always there, but the violence, the direct violence by Americans on Jews was less so.
Right. But we're talking about college campuses to some degree.
Yeah.
Patterns of exclusionary admissions policies.
Absolutely. My dissertation advisor, when he started at Harvard, was one of 6 graduate students at the whole of Harvard when he began. there were
But was that a
limits.
fluke or was that a policy? Let's
Informal policy.
Right.
It was an informal policy. It wasn't like Hungary where you had laws, the so-called numerous clauses law that would only allocate a certain percentage of Jews in certain places in society. But these were very exclusive entities. The same is true of the major prep schools that were on the East Coast. This really persisted until the 1960s.
And the same is true post-education, getting into professional careers.
That's absolutely right. And especially if you were a Jewish woman, it was made even harder. A friend of mine, I don't know if I should say his name, so I won't, had a father who was a well-known physicist and a mother who was a well-known mathematician. She went to Princeton. She won several math competitions that made certain members of the Manhattan Project look not so smart. Nevertheless, she was never able to get a job. It was not as bad as in the Soviet Union, where at the same time, Jews were almost wholly excluded from higher education or from the military, but it was certainly an informal policy that persisted.
I just think it's important to see a historic context.
Sure.
And so we see these expressions in overtly violent ways. We see them in more subtle ways. And there's a perniciousness as they continue on.
Well, there's a perniciousness, but there's also a degree to which they're interrelated with other forms of bias, and I don't want to move away from that. So as I was trying to say earlier, with the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, at least 10% of the religious institutions bombed in the South were Jewish institutions, and this is a fact that is almost wholly ignored in the scholarship, much less in popular memory of the civil rights movement.
But
This
let's
is a
put that in
problem.
context, right?
Yeah.
10%
Right.
of the institutions bombed.
Right.
Population-wise, it's actually a disproportionately higher number.
Right, 2% of the American population is Jewish. A little less than 2%, actually. And so to have 10% of these institutions bombed speaks to the power of anti-Semitic racism in the minds of those who were committing bombings of Black Baptist churches and other African American community organizations. This interrelated nature of hate is something that I think we've unfortunately moved away from as a society. Right? At the end of the day, an anti-Semite isn't terribly discerning. He's going to hate, often enough it's a man, but not always. He's not going to restrict his hatred just to Jews. He will direct it at other communities. I think the same is true of other forms of bias, yet speaking as somebody who advises multiple governments and few organizations, there is a tendency to silo each form of hatred separate from itself that has worked against us, and it goes back to population statistics as well. If you have more activists for one cause, often the chorus is going to be so loud that the smaller cause doesn't have a voice, and I'm afraid that's happened in the case of anti-Semitism.
But I do think that it's important to understand this interconnectivity. I said the first place I came back to speak after October 7th was at Hillel here. And I'm reminded of his great contemplative, if I am not for me, who will be? If I am only for me, what am I? And if not now, when? And I think one of the interesting things during the period of the civil rights movement is the interconnectivity of a variety of communities and the role that the organized Jewish community played in so much of the organizing for civil rights for African Americans and for others. And so, yes, there was targeting, but that targeting of Jewish institutions didn't seem to limit the work of Jewish activists in the South and looking at a broader question of how we get to a more perfect union, to speak to the language of our founders.
That's right. Several of the young adults killed by the Klan in the South were Jews. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched side by side with Martin Luther King and with other leaders of the civil rights movement. And they did it because Jewish values, which ultimately at the end of the day are shared values that we have, be humble, be kind, try to make the world better, compelled them to move forward, to work with others. Now, there's a tendency to only focus on the positive at the sake of more negative relations, and at the same time, there were tensions, especially in urban areas, between Jewish communities and other communities. But there's been a tendency, I would say, particularly within academic scholarship, to focus more on the tension and less on the harmony.
You say that the lynching was the first truly directly targeted violent act. Where do we go from there?
So after that, there are occasional acts of murderous violence up until the civil rights movement. Then things quieted down. Again, speaking here of outright violence, but also anti-Semitism became a less accepted form of bias in non-Jewish American society, especially in Anglo-Saxon society. So there was a higher rate of integration in the 1970s, but there were still crimes that were being committed. So there were shootings on the Brooklyn Bridge of a group of yeshiva students. There was the Crown Heights riot. But these, again, remained somewhat sporadic events until 2014. And I mentioned 2014 for a reason. That's when you have the shooting at the Overland Park Jewish Community Center, where a white supremacist in this case went to the community with a gun with a specific intent to murder Jews. And his victims in this case turned out to be non-Jews because it was a day of interfaith dialogue and celebration. But after Overland Park, Kansas, you have one shooting after another, the most notorious at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, but not only the Tree of Life Synagogue. You have hostage takings of Jewish community centers. You have the rise of an unfortunate reality for American Jews who are observant, namely the installation of hard security measures just to worship. This is something that I think is very important to underline. I grew up Catholic. I never had to go through a metal detector to go to church. The priests might have wanted me to because I wasn't always the best kid, but I never had to go through a metal detector. Jews in the United States have to go through security to worship. So too do some Black Baptist churches in the South and a few other communities, but this is a phenomenon that is almost wholly unknown to the rest of the American community. That's a problem. If every evangelical Christian had to go through security to worship, I guarantee the dynamic would change. So why are we allowing our Jewish brothers and sisters to have to go through that ordeal just to practice their faith and remember their culture? It's a challenge.
And so is that an American dynamic or is that a broader global dynamic?
Oh, it's certainly a broader global dynamic. The same is true across Europe, particularly in Western Europe. Most European countries, interestingly enough, will provide some measure of support so that there is not a burden on Jewish communities to provide their own security. So in Belgium, the local police or the military will provide security, for example. It gets tricky in Switzerland because they often enough don't want to support it. But by and large, you get some community support. Here in the U.S., you don't.
Well, in California, you do.
Oh, you do?
Right? So
that's good to hear. Okay.
After the Poway synagogue incident,
Okay.
there were state grants that were made available in California. They're not extended to every synagogue, but they're available broadly, and people compete for them. I don't know of any other state that's taken a similar role.
I live in Maryland, so my Jewish friends tell me that some of one of my friends' congregations, they've essentially had to convert the basement into apartments, and they give the apartments for free to police officers so that they always have a police officer on site because they have no external support to make this happen.
So we're at 2014. So what's from 2014 to 2023, what does the dynamic look like?
Progressively worse. By and large, most of the attacks that are happening focused on Jews are coming from right-wing extremists who have access to guns. The statistics prove that. It might sound like a hot political point, but it's really not. It's statistically
But in
proven.
2023, it changes.
Correct.
Because now it's not just a right-wing anti-Semitic expression, but quite frankly, a centrist left.
Centrist left, but also far left and coming from Islamist circles. Essentially, by 2022, 2023, we have what was happening in countries like Germany in 2014. Why do I say Germany? Germany is an illustrative example of the challenge we have. So I'll come back to 2023 in a minute. But in 2014, in Germany, in the city of Wuppertal, the synagogue is firebombed. 3 individuals made Molotov cocktails, threw them at the synagogue. Why? Well, they were all arrested, so they were asked. They said they did it because they were protesting Israeli policy in Gaza. But they went after a local Jewish community, which has nothing to do with Israeli policy in Gaza. Unfortunately, German courts found this to be an acceptable form of protest and let these guys go. But the same thing begins happening in the United States. You have certain movements, some coming from, we'll call them extremist religious groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites, some coming from individuals who are associated with the anti-Israel movement, who begin to start to attack churches. Now that is not terribly surprising, but what we've seen since 2022, 2023 has been disturbing. And let me tell you what I mean by this. Let's go to Toronto for a second. We'll get outside of California. In Toronto, you have a number of protests against Israeli policy in Gaza, predominantly organized by the far right.
This is prior to October 7th.
Prior to, but also right after. There was one in 2022 as well because there was an enhanced action that the Israeli state undertook. Very quickly, these far left protests were joined by far right individuals. So you see the Palestinian flag next to the swastika, which is problematic on multiple levels, because the degree to which the anti-Semitic invective the degree to which anti-Semitism is being voiced is such that it begins to attract the more traditional far-right anti-Semitic crowd, and you end up with a phenomenon that was unusual until the COVID pandemic. For lack of a better analogy, you have biker gangs next to neo-hippies engaged in the same form of protest, united by only one thing, their irrational hatred of Jews. We're seeing some of this start to happen in the United States as well, including on college campuses. There aren't many neo-Nazis on college campuses that I'm aware of, but you see people coming from outside the campus walls who represent far-right movements, engaging in dialogue with people on the extreme left, and that boomerang effect is happening as well. It's dangerous because, again, statistically speaking, the far right is more likely to commit violence. But if the far left has already been so radicalized, violence could also occur.
It's interesting to me that in the last 18 months, because of what we've seen on college campuses, the conversation has really been just around the far left.
Right.
We've lost sight of some of the conversation about the far right. We've lost sight of Virginia and the chance of Jews will not replace us.
Yep.
And I'm also worried that what we're seeing is a condemnation of anti-Semitism in the political sphere seems to be picking whose anti-Semitism they take issue with. So it's not a universal condemnation of anti-Semitism, but it's a condemnation of anti-Semitism that's aligned with a political ideology other than my own.
That's right. And Jonathan Chait just had a very good article about this in The Atlantic, I think it was yesterday, so which I recommend that everyone read, but he outlines this very directly. The best example is what we're seeing today in Washington, D.C. There is, I would argue, an appropriate attempt to try to wrestle with campus anti-Semitism, started actually by the Biden administration, that's being continued by the Trump administration through the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. Okay. And I think it's undeniable that there have been cases of anti-Semitism on some college campuses in the wake of October 7th. Those need to be investigated and dealt with appropriately according to the law.
Let me just pause right there, because I think this is where there's a lot of struggle on college campuses by, I think, well-meaning individuals, myself, I hope included, in this conversation about this intersection in trying to define the lines between what is protected speech and what crosses the line. Where do we balance between, for example, First Amendment protection that is sacrosanct on a college campus and our other sets of obligations. I would say in the old days, other constitutional amendments that protect individuals, or in a more contemporary way, Title VI obligations. And I think the Biden administration started some of that discussion. And I think campuses writ large were very slow to figure out how to navigate this tension.
Well, if campuses have figured it out, that would be remarkable, because I still think they're struggling with it in a real way. At the end of the day,
well, maybe I was being too kind.
Yeah,
I think many campuses were flat-footed.
That's right.
And only looked at the First Amendment protections and didn't look at all at the balancing questions.
Well, I think actually, just as we were going to discuss seeing anti-Semitism through a political lens, I think campuses look at the First Amendment through a particular lens and only focus on the freedoms part, but not the exercise of freedoms in a way that is responsible. The old adage that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater holds true. Why can't you shout fire in a crowded theater? Not everybody understands that phrase. You can't, because it can lead to a panic. People run, people get crushed at trying to make their way to the exit, people get injured. The same can be true of certain forms of speech that transgress a line, and it's up to the courts to decide what that line is, but transgress a line that leads to violence against groups. This is also something that holds in international law, and the Supreme Court has found this to be true as well. If you're calling for direct acts of violence against groups or individuals, you're engaging in forms of speech that are dangerous. Where that line is on the campus is unknown.
I saw on a college campus a non-tenured faculty member, not here,
Yeah.
but on another college campus in California, say, we know where they live.
Right.
We can target them in their homes. We should start with and I think the word was Jewish. It could have been Zionist, but we'll get back to journalists. We could target them and target their children.
Dangerous, violent, dangerous speech that needs to be investigated by the police or other security services. Absolutely. In Boston, there were maps drawn up of where every Jew lives in Boston. They're not doing that for innocent reasons. They're doing it to create or at least invite acts of violence or intimidation. That crosses a line. That crosses a line from civil speech to aggressive violence. Now, the challenge in the US context has always been the approach, which usually leads to it being ex post facto. You have the speech, the person commits the crime, then you can put them on trial for two things, not just the speech. It's very, very thorny. I don't think we are at a moment as a broader society where we can trust that the decisions will always be the most just. Mm-hmm. But within the context of a campus, I think there is a large responsibility to ensure that students are learning in a way that is free of a hostile environment, just like you would try to prevent a hostile work environment in the business world, while at the same time protecting academic speech and academic freedom so you can engage in a civil and informed debate. I want to just underline the word informed, though, because the other problem that I've seen on a great many campuses, but also in wider academic work and in the work of public intellectuals, is people veering from their lane. I'm trained as a German historian. I have Russian, I have French, I have a couple other languages. I'm not going to weigh in on the Middle East. Why? Because I don't have access to Hebrew or Persian or Arabic or Urdu or any of the languages of the region, and I don't have the training. But a number of the people who engage in academic work in some fields, again, I come from the humanities, I think I can safely say it's mostly from the humanities, don't let the fact that they don't have training or linguistic capacity or any deep knowledge prevent them from speaking out. And I find that to be intellectually dishonest. Mm-hmm. And that's also a challenge that we have today. Everybody's an expert. We see this online. It's the Twitter problem, or whatever we call that platform today.
We saw that express itself here at the University of California. You saw academic disciplines that really weren't in that specific area taking positions. And then you saw the Board of Regents debating, limiting the abilities of departments to take positions outside of their course offerings.
Right.
In wanting to distinguish between the academic mission and opinion, and differentiate opinion platforms from academic discourse platforms.
Right.
Have you seen anybody successfully navigate these
Yes,
discussions?
But it's a historical case. The University of Chicago made the decision in the late 1960s.
But they said take no position.
Exactly, and that seems to have worked for their campus, at least in making public positions on behalf of departments. Nobody's saying that a professor whose background is in, I don't know, I'll make something up so nobody thinks I'm picking on them, Lilliputian thought, they're welcome to speak out about any issue that they want. But the fact that they do so without the background is irresponsible, and there should be a counter to that.
Well, I think there's a difference. You can have an opinion.
Right.
But the question is the opinion an opinion, or is an opinion in the guise of academic discourse?
And if you're an 18-year-old on campus and somebody has the title doctor, you may not know. You may not be able to make that choice. If you're in the press and somebody has the title doctor, you're going to think that they are an expert on whatever you put before them. The mediatic environment in which we work is part of the problem. Back to your larger question, no, I haven't seen anyone do it successfully, other than those campuses that have decided to take a stance of restricting speech by their departments. It's at least created a calmer environment on campus for them.
So I worry that you and I have had a little bit too much of a theoretical conversation about this. And what are we seeing in the real world? What are the impacts that we're seeing? I hear from students, I hear from faculty, I hear from staff about what it does to their sense. And I hate to use the word belonging because it's taken on a different meaning of late. But there have been questions of whether or not we're a hostile or inviting place, and what are real world impacts on campus communities and on broader communities?
I think we need to go outside the campus community, because we have to remember that no university exists in its own bell jar. The outside world comes in, the campus goes out. If you look at American society as a whole, polls by the American Jewish Committee in particular show that the vast majority of American Jews have changed their behavior, not just since October 7th, but even before October 7th, roughly since 2015, 2016. And especially, you mentioned Charlottesville earlier, especially since Charlottesville. This means if you are an Orthodox man, you will not go out with your kippah or your yarmulke. If you have a necklace that has a Star of David on it, you'll tuck it in. People are identifying less as Jewish online because they're afraid of being targeted from forms of online anti-Semitism. They're essentially being forced to live their lives under a bushel basket and not express who they are. Something that we don't ask of many other communities, or at least those of us with consciences don't ask of other communities. But this is something that a number of Jewish Americans are beginning to experience. I'm hearing this from Jewish students on campus as well, and I know that their parents are concerned about this because they come to me and I'm sure to you and to others who are working on campuses today. This is also something that we've seen in the European Union, in the EU case since roughly 2015, when there were a number of terror attacks in France. But there they've also begun to change their behavior and not identifying as Jewish in as public a way as they had prior. And
but just look at France.
Yeah.
When Charlie Hebdo was attacked,
right,
you saw a different response than what you've seen of late.
Well, you have and you haven't. So you had the shootings at Charlie Hebdo, and then there was a kosher supermarket. And then briefly, you had a remarkable thing where the heads of state of most of the EU countries, including Germany, came to France, marched, and declared anti-Semitism has no place in Europe. And they said it for two reasons. One, the horror of those attacks in 2015, and also the long legacy of the Holocaust. As a result, from a policy perspective, and I come at it from a policy perspective more often than not, the European Union as a whole developed what was known as an action plan to combat anti-Semitism. And this was a stem-to-stern approach, including university campuses, but also including training of civil servants. I'll come back to that in a moment. Each EU country, with the exception of one or two at this point, has developed their own national action plan to deal with anti-Semitism and to protect Jewish life as a response. The question is, has it had an effect? And that's a different question. I think it depends on the country, because if you look across the EU at this time, the same time, anti-Semitism has increased significantly. On average, in Germany, it's gone up 85% over the last decade, for example. And this is the country that cares most about fighting anti-Semitism. I don't know if these are actually having an effect, because a lot of these policies and a lot of these approaches don't amount to much more than virtue signaling. A checkbox to say that we're trying to do the right thing instead of actually doing the right thing. Here in the United States, there hasn't been the same policy approach until the middle of the Biden administration. President Biden, to his credit, convened a group to develop our own action plan to deal with anti-Semitism. Now, that action plan has been removed from the White House website, but it also had a number of recommendations that I don't think have had an opportunity to take effect significantly. So it's been left up to civil society organizations. Sorry, I work in the EU a lot. It's been left up to NGOs to handle here in the United States, and that's difficult because they don't have the same level of resources as the government. They don't have the same breadth of exposure and experience as a government organization. And they come to it from a variety of angles, which can lead to some confusion. It's a very, very difficult time. I think ultimately the only solution is going to, ironically enough, come down to the educators. Because it's only through education that we'll have a hope of turning people's opinions away from things that are anti-Semitic. And there is hope. I want to go back to one other survey here in the United States, the Pew survey. The Pew organization regularly takes surveys of the American public and their views on a variety of topics. And they even ask questions from time to time about how non-Jews feel about Jews. And we know because of these surveys that the vast majority of non-Jews in the United States know that anti-Semitism is wrong, and they respect, or at least they claim to respect, their Jewish neighbors. Now, this is a cause for hope. But the problem is, even if 75% say that anti-Semitism is wrong, I guarantee that the vast majority of that 75% think the anti-Semite is the guy wearing the armband, walking in with a swastika, and acting a certain way. We're talking about a form of hatred that, depending on when you want to start it, I usually start in the year 300 BC with the writings of the Greeks, is at least 2,300 years old. Some will say 3,000. I don't know. I don't know about the fall of Babylon. But let's say 2,300, 3,000 years old. That means it cuts across every religion, every society, every social class, every ethnicity, every community. There are aspects of anti-Semitism that are shared. It comes from the left, it comes from the right, it comes from religious sources, it comes from ideological and political sources. There's no single form of anti-Semitism. And we started talking about this earlier. This is where the politics comes in. There's a tendency among parties on the left, globally, not just here in the US, close that eye and only focus on what's happening on the right. And what we're seeing today is a tendency by parties on the right to close this eye and only focus on what's on the left. We're going to lose if we continue to fight anti-Semitism this way. We're also going to lose if we continue to see anti-Semitism as something that is wholly unto itself. Now, anti-Semitism has a particular history, a particular context, particular forms of expression, a particular age. People call it the world's oldest hatred. I call it the second oldest hatred. I think hatred of women probably predated it. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, it's an ancient form of hatred, which means other forms of hate borrow from it. And you see this time and time and time again. Anti-Semitic rhetoric of fin de siècle France, late 19th century France, found its way into forms of anti-Black rhetoric of the early 20th century. Anti-Semitic caricatures created by the Nazis of Jewish men trying to prey upon non-Jewish women have found their way into anti-Muslim caricatures on the cover of magazines in Poland just over the course of the last few years. There are parallels. It doesn't mean they're the same. You can't take a cornucopia approach to fighting hate. You have to know what makes each one unique. But there are parallels and points of intersection.
And we see it now with expressions of anti-immigrant
That's
sentiments.
right. Absolutely.
Using the same tropes, using same blood purity language.
Yes. Yeah. And it comes up again and again. And even things that might not seem anti-Semitic at first blush might have anti-Semitism hidden beneath them. The Great Replacement theory, very anti-Semitic. It's been with us, although people like to blame the French for it, it's been with us since the 1880s and 1890s, when American magazines had political cartoons warning Americans that New York was going to become New Jerusalem because of all the Jews coming to the United States who were fleeing pogroms in Russia. That's been with us a long time. But the other way that it seeps in, well, we saw this during the COVID pandemic with QAnon. QAnon at first blush doesn't look to be terribly anti-Semitic. And then you go down the rabbit hole and it's all about a cabal of individuals who are controlling the economy, controlling politics, kidnapping children and committing atrocities against them to get their blood. These are all old anti-Jewish myths that have been with us in the case of the blood libel more than 1,000 years. And it's right there in our face. This is why it is such a hard problem to root out, but we're never going to shift the dynamic if we don't talk about it.
So how do we, you said one side covering one eye, the other covering the other eye. How do we get us to take our hands down? How do we get to introspection? I mentioned Rabbi Hillel before. Enai nani li mi li, if I'm not for me, who will be? I think that really is an important question.
Yeah.
That if nobody else is going to speak up, we don't speak up for ourselves. But the other, great quote by him that I'm always reminded of is his version of the Golden Rule. That which you find hateful, do not do to your fellow. And how do we take, whether it's his version or the broader Golden Rule version, and get folks to look at othering and look introspectively and question themselves and where there may be uncomfortable truths of the way they've processed information themselves?
I think at the end of the day, and hopefully the political theorists won't get mad at me, I'll steal a little from John Rawls, right? You want to try to occasionally operate behind a veil of ignorance, by which I mean, close your eyes and think, if I didn't know about this room that I'm sitting in, these lights around me, the individuals who are here with me, what would I want out of life? I'd want to be treated well. I'd want opportunities to succeed. I'd want to help others succeed. Think about all the things you would want to have a happy, fulfilling life. And then you extend that grace to others. That's part of it. But I think part of it is also learning about our own experiences. The experiences of our neighbors. Our own experiences matter too. But you have to get a sense of the societies and the cultures around you, and you have to build up the respect of these societies, what makes them unique, what makes them special, what makes them beautiful. Life is about learning. If you're always willing to learn, chances are you'll probably be able to live with others in a little more harmony. Not always.
I'm going to push back.
All right.
Because I think people increasingly satisfy themselves with echo chamber and call it learning, and with little confirmation bias and call it learning. I found information that supports my predisposed assumptions and call it learning. So how do we go from that? And what is learning? What form does this discourse need to exist in broader society, but specifically in places of higher education? How do we hold ourselves to a standard of actual learning.
You push yourself outside your comfort zone. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's the echo chambers that are part of the problem. We put ourselves in echo chambers because it's comfortable. The real world's not comfortable, right?
But I mean, maybe it's my gray hair speaking, but I think that societally we're in a more difficult time.
Yes.
When I was a kid, there were 3 networks. And even if I didn't like the way ABC, CBS, or NBC were covering the news, there was a common set of understanding that we all had societally, and we could react to it and have an analysis that differed from the assumptions that were made in that story, but there was a common ground.
Right.
And now there's very little broadcast that gets to people.
Right.
People are self-selecting information, and perhaps even more dangerously, algorithms are selecting for us.
Yes.
So I think these are generationally different challenges.
Absolutely. The mediatic environment in which we live is so overwhelming, so difficult to process that it makes things almost impossible to see a way out. It's not the first time this has happened. I do think we are in for a period of pain given the media environment in which we live. But eventually, if human history teaches us anything, we learn to cope. There have been crises of media consumption in the past. Unfortunately, they often predate moments of intense societal, political, or even military stress. The rise of literacy probably had a hand in the French Revolution. Prior to the Nazi rise of power, there were 25,000 newspapers or magazines circulating in Germany, which had a population of about 70 million people, which is way too many, perhaps. But there was a publication for every opinion, to go to the crux of the problem. With too much information, people can't process, and they always gravitate to the extremes. They also tend to go for what is spicy. It's easy to consume, but also something that has a currency so that you can share it. You can possess a form of knowledge and then share that knowledge, and that gives you a subconscious psychological thrill that you were able to share information no matter how terrible with the wider world. This is what we see on platforms like X. There's no longer a moment at which there's a opportunity to reflect. Do I really need to share this with the world? You just hit retweet. Or even worse, platforms like TikTok, where the decision to retweet isn't even in your hands anymore. It's just the algorithms choosing it. I think we'll figure it out, but I think it will take time. On the college campus, though, that is why you have to move outside of your comfort zone. You can't only engage with the scholarship that you like. You can't only assume that the theory that seems convenient explains everything in the world. You can't believe your own BS. And unfortunately, I think we see a little bit too much of that. The other element that I think that is really important to see our way out is to recognize a few things and to recognize the power of a few moments in our common and our shared history. Maybe it's because I'm a Holocaust historian and I think, that maybe that makes me a hammer that sees everything as a nail, but nevertheless, I think the history of the Holocaust has a very important role to play here. Why do I say this? There's a well-known Jewish writer, Emil Fackenheim, who was trying to deal with the question of where was God at Auschwitz. And Fackenheim, I won't go into the theology here, essentially said there is God at Auschwitz, otherwise there would have never be a God. But the one thing that he did as he wrestled with this question was realize that the reality of the Holocaust forces a need to protect Jewish life and culture because we know it can be eradicated. All right. Now, he was speaking to a primarily Jewish audience. I think that extends to those of us who are not Jewish. I think anyone who engages with the subject of the Holocaust, the reality that a Western civilized society that was highly literate engaged in a transcontinental, because let's not forget there were also attacks in North Africa, a transcontinental effort to wipe out an entire people happened within the memory of people who are still alive with us today.
But sadly, very few.
Less than 200,000. Yes.
Very few. I mean, when I was Speaker of the Assembly, we would do a Holocaust memorial ceremony every year.
Right.
And we started realizing how our ability to do that would decline over time, and it pales in comparison to what Shoah Foundation has done. But we started getting legislators to go out and interview survivors in their own districts and liberators in their own districts, so that there'd be some ongoing discourse that even succeeded first-person accounts, because time is a horrible thing. But I'm also reminded, because you talked about the interconnectivity of this, the atrocities in Armenia.
Yes.
And I remember going to the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan and being struck by the images and how similar they were to the images of boxcars in Germany. And then quotes from Hitler that said, "Who will remember the Armenians?"
Mm-hmm.
I worry that we're getting to a point where too few folks remember the Holocaust. I remember as a third or fourth grader, a group of Holocaust survivors coming in and talking to my class and the impact it made. How do we not lose that impact in a time when fewer and fewer people even understand what happened, and unfortunately a rising number don't believe it?
Two ways. And the first is to not treat the Holocaust as an allegory or a morality tale. The Holocaust was a historical event of its own merits, and that merit is significant because it's worth noting that after the Holocaust, the scale of destruction was so great that we had to build entire international institutions to try to come out of the damage. Those institutions include things like the UN, NATO, the EU, yes, of course, but also the entire human rights structure and discourse that we live under today was created in some way in the shadow of the Holocaust. And I think it's not a coincidence that as those institutions are being called into question, declines in knowledge of the Holocaust are also happening. The other piece of it, the other really important piece of it, the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their accomplices. But at the same time that the Holocaust happened, roughly 80 million people were killed during the course of the Second World War. Now, a significant number of those were killed in related atrocities by the Nazis and their accomplices. These include Roma, so-called gypsies. These include homosexuals. These include communist prisoners of war. These include the disabled. These include LGBT communities. They also include Serbs, Poles, Ukrainians, and others. Tens of millions of people murdered because the Nazis wanted to kill the Jews. This history is intertwined. It is not just unique to the Jews. The Holocaust is is part of Jewish history. The other atrocities intersect. We continue to intersect. We continue to lose sight of that. I think that will be our downfall if we don't change it.
So we've got to wrap in a minute. I'm reminded of another great quote, Dr. King, that I think speaks to this, that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. And so the question becomes how we express that light ourselves in our actions to counter all the forms of darkness. And if you have a few closing comments that you want to add before we wrap.
Well, I'll paraphrase one of Dr. King's friends, Rabbi Heschel, who I mentioned earlier. I'll get the quote wrong, so it'll be a paraphrase. But Rabbi Heschel famously said that the greatest goal in life is not just to amass knowledge, but it's to act with courage. We have a lot of smart people in the world. On campus, those who are engaging in anti-Semitism numerically are the minority. Too few people are speaking up against them because they lack the courage.
That's right. And I think that courage and the need to act is really the call to action that can be the light that King spoke of. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your incredible work.
Thank you. I appreciate it.